coming to the conflict in Ukraine, recently Zelensky was talking about negotiations and political settlement. And he said that his country is not capable of continuing this war. And at the same time, we had Bloomberg reporting that NATO is not capable of providing Ukraine with weapons. If they're not capable of providing Ukraine with weapons for years, why they're trying to continue sending weapons as they know that wouldn't change the result, the outcome of this conflict?
Well, the problem is that we are looking at this conflict from the wrong angle. The problem has never been to help Ukraine. Never. It has always been to harm Russia and using Ukraine for that. And I have mentioned on your channel already this famous report of the Rand Corporation that was written in April 2019 that outlines the strategy to extend Russia, meaning to weaken Russia, in order to make it uninteresting as an ally for China. That's the ultimate goal is China in reality. But to avoid Russia to become a strong ally of China, the idea was to weaken Russia, which is something that a lot of European countries would welcome, especially the Baltic states and Poland and all that. Okay, for historical reasons. But anyway, coming back to this report outlines the strategy. And in this report, the use or the misuse of Ukraine to achieve the goal of extending Russia is mentioned. And even this report mentions that it's a dangerous game for Ukraine because it was anticipated in this report that trying to tackle Russia by using Ukraine would lead to probably not the disparation, disparation of Ukraine, but at least Ukraine would lose territories, would lose a lot of individuals. I mean, have a lot of losses and casualties, and Ukraine will be pushed into unfavorable negotiations. So everything we are witnessing today was already, in fact, outlined in this report, meaning that we knew that we were misusing Ukraine. Therefore, the name of the game is not to help Ukraine; it's to harm Russia. And that's exactly what we're witnessing today. The problem is that the Ukrainians didn't understand that, and probably Zelensky didn't understand that. And the nationalist part of the establishment, let's say, probably not the government, but the establishment. I mean, those who exert pressure on the government and on Zelensky in particular, those guys thought that with the help of NATO, they will once for all have a decisive victory against Ukraine. But other people, even, I mean, the common Ukrainians may not have this view. The problem is that today we are in a situation that we see no solution, in fact. There is no solution on the ground. There's no other solution than discussing and negotiating. And that's what just Zelensky just so he expected, and from the very beginning, remember that on the 25th of February, so 2022, that means one day after the beginning of the Russian special military operation, Zelensky asked to negotiate. He asked the Russians to negotiate. Eventually, you had the first round of negotiations. Even the Ukrainian negotiators were killed by the Ukrainian Secret Service. So Ukrainian negotiators, and that was, by the way, confessed by the head of the military intelligence, because negotiators, or at least one of them, of the negotiators, was a member of the military intelligence. And this guy was killed by the Ukrainian security service. So you see that between services, you even had to strike, because, and in the SBU, the security service, you had these hardcore nationalists, and they didn't want any negotiation. And this first round of negotiation that happened at the Belarusian border, it collapsed, and that opened the door for a second round of negotiation that was much discussed, and we have discussed that on your channel as well, in Turkey, and that almost reached an agreement in March 2022. Anyway, we don't discuss that. But it's important to remember that in March 2022, Zelensky was ready to have an agreement with the Russians. And in this agreement, by the way, the Russians accepted the idea of withdrawing their forces from Ukraine, with the status of the two republics, I mean, the Republic of Lugansk and Donetsk, those two republics, plus the status of Crimea, would have still to be discussed. But that's but basically all Russian troops would have been withdrawn from Ukraine. And Zelensky was pressed by the Brits, namely Boris Johnson, to renounce to this initiative. That came from him, by the way. The initiative came from the Ukrainians. So he proposed something. The Russians were ready to enter an agreement based on that proposal, and there was probably some adjustments, but then came the Westerners and told Zelensky, no, keep your proposal, don't go further with the Russians, and in exchange of that, we'll give you the support for as long as necessary. So basically, Zelensky traded peace for a support as long as necessary. And to do that, I assume that Zelensky had the idea that this support, the support he would receive from the NATO and the West in general, that this support would in fact bring victory. And that's the reason why he accepted the deal, or not the deal, yes, the deal offered by Boris Johnson. And that now he noticed that basically it's not going that way. And he had been, the West, in fact, has, and probably what I have to say is that the West underestimated the Russians. They thought that with their resources, and they had the feeling that their resources were almost unending. I mean, they had enough to offer the Ukrainians to achieve victory, because Russia was not strong enough to counter what the West would offer or provide as weapons and all that. So they expected a very quick victory over Russia. And with the time, Zelensky has noticed that this was not the case. So he has been deceived by the West to some extent. And now he noticed that the West has come to the point they cannot deliver weapons. And you were mentioning those Patriot systems from Israel, but I know that the U.S. asked Israel to provide this system, but I'm not sure that Israel will accept to do that, because now Israel is more or less planning to have an offensive against Hezbollah, and with all the drones and all that. And remember that recently, I mean, last week, the Hezbollah published a video showing that the Hezbollah could send drones over the whole northern part of Israel in order to target to make some to select possible targets and identify possible targets. And they have these drones have been on very very sensitive areas, meaning that these drones could not be intercepted. And all the pictures that we have, and this video is about 9 minutes, 20 seconds or so, and it has been published all over the social networks and all that. And it shows that the Hezbollah has in fact some kind of air superiority to some extent. Obviously, they don't have F-16, F-15, and all that, and F-35. So it's not. I'm not saying that Hezbollah has a definitive air superiority, but to some extent, it has the ability to be present in the air as never before. And therefore, the role of these anti-aircraft, anti-missile systems like the Patriot becomes critical for Israel. As a result, and the interesting thing is that the Americans had to ask Israel, which is a country at war, to provide weapons to another country at war. And that shows that the West has reached the limits of its capacity. And now France is boosting its production of artillery ammunition, and Germany is doing the same, and they tried to build a production plant in Ukraine. I'm not sure they are still with this idea because the Russians that bombed the locations of some factories and all that. So I'm not sure the Rheinmetall, which is one of the biggest tank producer and armored fighting producer in Germany, they planned to have such a production plan in Ukraine. I'm not sure they still have that, but you know, the thing is that the West has to boost its own production capabilities for Ukraine. But again, here we see also the limit, because for a company like Rheinmetall or others that you have Thales in France also, if you want to boost production, you have to make some investments. I mean, you have to buy hardware, you have to create some infrastructures, you need to, I mean, everything you need to produce weapons, to produce them, test them, and have engineering bureau and all that. But all these investments, why would you do such investments, huge and very heavy investments, if you are not even sure of the results, and even if you are not sure that this will last for 1, 6, 20 months? You don't know. You know, if you during the Cold War, it was a different story, because we were between the two blocks, we're facing each other, and it was, I mean, implicitly, everybody understood that we were facing those two blocks for decades, and that's what happened. So you could make investments for decades. You know that you will produce your weapons, you will improve them, and all that. So you have a constant flow of money, and therefore you can invest in infrastructure to produce your equipment. But if you don't know what tomorrow will be, I mean, look at we just discussed the situation in France. We don't know exactly, especially when we talk about the U.S. as well. We don't know what will be the policy the policy of the next president. And if he stops everything, that means everything you invested for producing more weapons and all that is lost. So which company would go blindly into investing for production of weapons if you don't even know what the policy will be in 3 months, 6 months from now? So this is the problem, and Zelensky understands that. And if we take in addition what Trump has already said on many occasions, that he would not give a single dollar more to the conflict in Ukraine. I mean, why would you start to make investments for a conflict which is doomed to stop by the end of the year? So and now Zelensky noticed that he has been tricked. And remember that in October 2022, Zelensky issued a decree prohibiting to open discussions with Russians as long as Vladimir Putin is in power. So now they're almost trapped in their own narrative because they were convinced they would win. And that's the reason why in October 22, they made Zelensky made this decree, because he expected that the famous counteroffensive of 2023 would bring victory. And today he's repeating exactly the same kind of narrative for 2025. But in 2025, if the US is not on board, there will be no counteroffensive at all, despite all the promises. And the promises, by the way, as we just discussed with the Patriot missile, the promises reach the limit of the capacities of the West, because there is no weapons anymore. And at the same time, this is also kind of that's where you see the snake is biting the tail, because European countries are asked to provide weapons to Ukraine, but at the same time, they flag the threat of Russia wanting to attack Europe. So that means that we are reaching the point where you have to decide whether you keep your weapons for you to defend yourself against the big Russian offensive, or you give them to Ukraine to fight the Russians. But then you would have nothing left if the Russians win anyway. And so the Europeans are trapped between their lies and the reality. And this is not new. I have described that in my previous book, because this situation could be anticipated already 2 years ago. And in fact, I think I wrote that the first time in my book on Operation Z, and the book was published in October 2022. So meaning that we could anticipate such a situation, because we knew that the whole Western, I use the word strategy, but it was not really a strategy. It was more a policy than a strategy. But in any case, this whole Western strategy / policy was based on the assessment that Russia would collapse within weeks. And that's the reason, by the way, why Zelensky accepted the deal with Boris Johnson in March 22, because he said, well, Russia is weak, and therefore they will not be able to resist so long to the flow of material, equipment, tanks, and everything that the West would provide. And this assessment was totally false. And this is the example of a failure of not just of the policies, but it's a failure in the decision making. And when I say decision making, I include the intelligence. But the purpose of intelligence is to provide these elements that allows the decision maker to build up a decision. So when you make a decision, in essence, you try to identify what are the possibilities and the options for the enemy, and you compare that with your own options and possibilities and capacities and capabilities. And if you see that the enemy has less capabilities than you and resources and whatever, then you can engage into a war. But that means that's a very simplified representation. But in any case, that's basically what you do when you buy a car. I mean, you don't buy a car, a big luxurious car, assuming that it will cost nothing. I mean, first of all, you have to check what is your salary and what is on your bank account in order to buy the car. But for that, you need to have a precise picture of the how you will pay that and how much money you will need and all that. If you have the wrong assessment of the price of the car and you assume that what you have is enough, even if you don't know exactly what you have, that's exactly the situation we're facing now. And that shows because that my work was precisely to advise governmental decision makers. And what I noticed with this conflict is the total absence of sound, robust intelligence. Even our intelligence services, and I can say that because there are reports that are written by the intelligence services. So we know what they feel and how they assess the situation, and when we read that, and that's very clear. For instance, with the Swiss Strategic Intelligence Service, they publish every year a report on the international strategic situation of Switzerland and the security situation of Switzerland. So we know exactly how they assess the situation. And when we see that, we can see that their assessment is just based on a narrative, not on factual observation, but just on a narrative. And we know that this narrative is crumbling today. So we can ask ourselves, why do we pay those guys? Because basically they are just telling us exactly what we see in the media, and we know that the media had created a kind of parallel world when we talk about when we talk about the different conflicts, by the way, about China, about Russia, about Palestine. We have literally a parallel world. As a result, we see that the institutions that we have and which are designed to help decision making and to document decision making and inform the decision making, these institutions have failed. And in addition to that, the common sense that you would expect from the political leadership, this common sense seems to have disappeared. And that was very much illustrated by the results of these European elections and the election in France and in other countries, by the way. It shows that Belgium, we have exactly the same thing. They had their elections at the same time as the European elections. But we saw exactly the same thing, that the population with the common sense of the individuals that you may have on the road or the street, these guys have understood that the leadership has absolutely no understanding whatsoever of the real situation. They live in a virtual reality somehow, and that, in my view, is extremely worrisome, because it has, first of all, obviously an impact on the lives of the Ukrainians, and probably an impact on the life of Ukraine as a country. So that's one thing. But we see exactly the same thing with the Palestinians and probably other parts of the world as well, by the way. But at the same time, we see that these we are not able to address all problems. We're not able to address problems in other parts of the world, and we see that there is a gap between the common sense of the population and the leadership, and that was very much illustrated by the conflict in Ukraine. And that's what Zelensky is realizing. He realizes now. I mean, remember, before the conference in Bergenstock, we have discussed this conference in Switzerland, this summit, and everybody was very positive about it. That was the summit for peace and all that. And even Zelensky himself was positive. But some individuals realized that it didn't make any sense. And we have discussed that. We will not do the same discussion again. But surprisingly, Zelensky realized that after the conference. And now he realized that despite his decree of October 2022, prohibiting him to discuss with Russia, he will need to discuss with the Russians. So we see that people slowly come to the reality, and the reality is something that we could see already 2 years ago. What is terrible is that nobody was able to identify that sooner, because all these months have, in fact, cost the lives of hundreds, thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of individuals. That's tragic if you think about it. When we look at conflicts like the First World War, my grandfather used to fight in World War One, and I always thought it was a terrible conflict, because everybody knew that it was a stupid conflict in essence. But there was no, I mean, it was totally disproportionate. The reasons that led these countries to enter a war and the outcome of this war were totally disproportionate. And we knew that from the very beginning, but nobody had, sorry, nobody had the courage to say, stop. We are just going in the totally wrong direction. And I always wondered, why didn't the leaders then didn't understand that sooner and decided, well, guys, let's stop that. It costs too much life for absolutely no outcome or no results and things like that. But today we see exactly the same thing. We know that this war would lead nowhere, especially from a Western perspective. I mean, from a Russian perspective, it led somewhere, because, in fact, the Russians have achieved their objectives. The objectives they stated at the beginning of the operation were, in fact, reached, and many times, in fact. So now the Russians are continuing, because the Ukrainians are fed with weapons and they are pushed to fight, so the Russians continue to fight. But in essence, they have already reached their objectives. I mean, they reached their objectives already 2 months after the beginning of the operation. So meaning that we are now 2.5 years into the conflict, and the 2 first months were decisive, and now we are just continuing. That's why the Russians. I mean, if you look at the map, you don't see any big movement from the Russian side because they're not interested. They didn't expect to take all Ukraine. They expected to. I mean, they will probably finish to secure, I would say, the Donbass region. That's what they will continue to do. But for the rest, they have achieved the objective. So we could have stopped this conflict. And by the way, the Russians were ready to stop the conflict in March. They have said so. Good. We are happy with the agreement that was almost signed or agreed upon by Ukrainians and Russians on the side. So now we are still continuing a war without any. I mean, the only purpose, as I said, is to harm Russia, to make Russia in a position that the war would become unpopular, and that the goal for the West is to have a regime change in Russia. That's the idea, not just to weaken Russia as such, but they consider that from a European perspective, if you want, the center of gravity in the Clausewitzian sense of the word. I mean, Clausewitz defined the center of gravity of a party in a war. Center of gravity is the point from which everything depends. That everything depends on that. The strength, all the possibilities, the options, the opportunities, and everything depends on that point. And for the West, the center of gravity of Russia is Vladimir Putin. And that's the reason why they feel that if Vladimir Putin is removed from his position, then it would be a victory because everything depends on Vladimir Putin for decision making, for the political system, the decision making system. Everything depends on him, and that's the purpose, and that explains why, and that's also explained why I anticipated that if you don't have any victory on the battlefield, that you would have terrorist actions, because then if you cannot reach or achieve success on the battlefield through destroying tanks and all that, then what the second step or the next step, if you want, is to attack the civilian population within Russia in order to make this population to be to take the leadership accountable for the war. And because nobody cares when soldiers die. Soldiers are made to die. If I, sorry to say so, it's a colonel that speaks. But this is the sad reality. If you have military dying, it's normal. But we don't like when civilians die. And that's the Western society. Nobody cares when we make war in Iraq and because we send soldiers. That's normal. They go, they die. But when you have 10 people attacked in a terrorist action by one of those guys who were attacked in Iraq, that starts a real problem domestically. That's the way we think in the West. It's very strange, by the way. In any case, that's exactly why you may switch from a strategy based on military confrontation on the battlefield to something different, to confront the civilian population within the territory. And that's also the reason why you had this authorization given by some countries, such as France, the UK, and the US, to authorize Ukraine to attack the depth of Russia. And when you say you attack the depth of Russia, that means you will attack civilians. And that's exactly what we discussed and what happened in Sevastopol, in Belgorod, in Moscow, and probably with the proxy organizations in Dagestan and all that, terrorist, mere terrorist activities. But the idea is to carry the war within the civilian population, so that the population would then ask the leadership to stop the war. That's exactly where we are, and it's extremely tragic, but it's also symptomatic that the West used exactly the same strategy as the Islamic State, because in fact, France, US, UK adopt exactly the same strategy as ISIL. And again, this is not invention. I mean, of course, when we had those terrorist attacks in 2015, 2016, we had that in Europe. We developed a narrative saying that the ISIS would like to destroy our democracies and our freedom and all that. But you don't destroy a democracy with a couple of bombs and just by killing two people on the road. This is not the way to destroy democracy, and not even freedom of speech or whatever. So the reason ISIS did that was, and that was explained in plain word. I could show the video, but probably this would then be banned by YouTube. But you have video where you have those guys from ISIS explaining, and that's the case I have in mind. These are on 3 or 4 videos that were made in French, where those guys explain in plain word what the strategy is. In fact, the strategy is that we bring the war. I mean, you kill us, and as long as you kill us, we'll do the same in your country. And the idea is that because you are a democracy, we'll attack you people so that you turn towards your leadership and you ask your leadership to stop the war. That's the idea. So it's not just killing people by revenge or things like that. No, there's nothing to do with that. The idea is we'll attack you so that if you don't, because you are a democracy. Democracy means the power of the people. That means that if we threaten you, it's up to you to ask your government to stop the war. That's the scheme. And in fact, if you look at what the West is doing in Russia, it's exactly that. They attack the population, and they expect the population to turn to Putin to say, well, now we attack in our cities, our children, and all that. So please stop the war and negotiate. That's exactly what the ISIS tried to do. It's exactly the same strategy. So we have, in essence, a terrorist strategy towards Russia. It's exactly the same. Exactly the same. Instead of having a missile, instead of having attacked, the ISIS used guys with the explosive belt or something like that. But the principle is exactly the same, and the idea is exactly the same. The idea was not to destroy democracy, but to use democracy, to make the population, in that particular case, or French population, to ask the president to stop the intervention in Syria and in Iraq. So we are doing exactly the same thing today with Russia. And so and when I say we and the West, I include, of course, Ukraine. So we are in a situation where there is absolutely no morality in the way we wage war. The West has misused Ukraine to provoke Russia, to provoke it on operational field. That's exactly what I explained by preparing an offensive against the Donbass in 2021 and starting this offensive early 2022. And that prompted a reaction from Russia. And so that's the operational level of the provocation, if you want. There is, of course, in the background, as others have said already, but for me, it's more a background than something more specific. If the expansion of NATO, which is very often mentioned as the main reason for the intervention of Russia, I don't agree with that. I think it's an important aspect of the conflict. It's something that the Russians considered as existential, but also an issue that Russia wanted to discuss at diplomatic level. And they wanted to have a negotiation on that and to solve the problem politically, not militarily. The problem is that the two problems, the problem of Donbass and the problem of NATO, if you want, converged. And when Ukraine started this offensive against the Donbass, and then as a result, and again, in application of the principle of Clausewitz, the Russians have decided, okay, you put us into the military confrontation, we'll go into that, but our objective will be, first of all, to protect the population of Donbass, and since we'll get an advantage position on that, we'll trade that situation with the problem of NATO. So it's a multi-level approach to the conflict, which is very much in the way of thinking. That's why I have this book here on the art of the Russian art of war, because that's exactly how they think. They don't see the problems as disconnected from each other. They see the problems and everything that leads to war and peace, by the way, as I could say, like a tree with all the small roots and the tiniest roots of the conflict and all the branches, which are the consequences of the conflict. So it's a holistic approach to the conflict. And that's exactly how the Russians see the problem. And the West, unfortunately, didn't understand the conflict that way. That's the reason why we thought that by provoking Russia and then to counter the Russian offensive with sanctions, massive sanctions, the whole system would collapse and would provoke this regime change that is expected by the West. But the problem is that when you study all the aspects of that, and by the way, I anticipated again in my early book, Operation Z, and again, October 2022, I could say this is a wrong assumption, and the result will be exactly the opposite. That's exactly what we are witnessing 2 years later, because when you analyze the structure of the Russian economy, the structure and the Russian society, also the societal aspects of the Russians. I mean, this idea, the Russians, when you start attacking, for instance, we were talking about terrorist attacks. You take the Sevastopol attack, for instance, which is not strictly speaking, not terrorist in substance. It's probably more terrorist in nature than in substance. But anyway, what I mean is that when if you look at the reaction of the Russians after that, even the Russians would be ready to go in a nuclear war. You know, the Russians is a people that have suffered casualties for their freedom during World War II. I mean, no country in the world has suffered as many casualties as they did. But every family in Russia has a parent who died in this conflict, and for them, fighting for their country is 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 more important as anything. They are ready for that because that's their history, that's their culture. So trying to imagine that you can defeat the Russians just by making a few provocations and thinking the whole thing will collapse, this is totally ignorance. The Russians are so accustomed to war and to be attacked, by the way, because the West is attacked so many times. I mean, we can come back to Napoleon, but in just after World War One, the West attacked Russia because they attacked the Soviet Union at that time in 1918, and then of course the Operation Barbarossa, the German operation against the Soviet Union. So the Russians, and we could go even to the War of Crimea in the mid 19th century. So always the West tried to attack Russia. So they are used to. So they are, and they never failed to respond. The Russians never collapsed, never said, they never gave up. And why should they give up today? So this is kind of a national history, national mentality. As a result, when you start with terrorist operation on their territory, that makes them just more angry and more ready to fight. That will not discourage them. And that's where we see our inability to assess a country which has a different history, a different historical background, a different societal background. By the way, we made exactly the same mistake with in the Middle East, because we underestimated the ability and the willingness of the individual to resist the power. We thought that because we have more powerful weapons, this would just discourage the others to resist. Well, they didn't resist. I mean, they resist on the ground there, but also they extended the battlefield to us. And it's interesting because we wage war by extending the battlefield to the Middle East, but we don't accept when they extend their battlefield to our country. You know, and that shows that with this war against terror, the global war against terror, we didn't learn anything. And in fact, even since World War II, we haven't learned anything. We think that everything goes by intimidation and all that. And that, for a short period of time, there were probably some element of truth in that, because if you look at what happened just after the collapse of the Soviet Union, during the 90s, in fact, you had this decade in which US and the West at large, but the US in particular, was the most powerful nation in the world, economically, militarily, in different aspects. And therefore, they could afford to wage war without having a response, because nobody could compete with the Western capabilities. Today, we are in a totally different situation because both Russia, China, and others, including Iran, by the way, because isolating Iran for so many years has led Iran to build up its own capabilities. I mean, and when I say capabilities, I'm not just meaning individuals with a rifle, but I'm also meaning engineering capabilities, development capabilities. You know, today, because they were isolated, they had the Iranians had to develop their own capabilities for developing weapons, to create new weapons, to develop some technologies and to develop capabilities to produce this technology, and so on and so forth. And by the way, it's exactly what happened in the 60s and the 70s with South Africa. Because South Africa was so isolated, it had to create its own military industrial complex because nobody wanted to provide weapons to South Africa. They were under embargo. So they had to develop their own capabilities. And very quickly, South Africa became one of the most active arms producer in the world, and most aggressive, by the way. And they worked, by the way, intensively with the Israelis, including for the development of the nuclear bomb, because the Israelis could test their first nuclear bomb in South Africa. So isolating countries doesn't discourage those people. On the contrary, historically, on the contrary, it boosts their capabilities. And you know, I mean, all these countries are extremely educated. They are historically, they have a very high level of education, a high level in engineering, in everything. They were probably for a short while after World War II, probably they didn't have the capability, and they probably had the need to develop all that because they were in a context that doesn't need to have weapons. But when you push them, you corner them in a situation where they need weapons, then they will develop them. And today, Iran is a major weapons producer. Israeli has become also one. South Africa was one, and so on, and Russia, obviously, because the reason why we have no longer these industrial capabilities to produce weapons is because after the collapse of the Soviet Union, people felt that we could live in peace, and therefore we don't need weapons. I mean, we just need a minimum amount of weapons and just a minimal production capabilities and capacity, but that was it. And today, by flagging the risk of war in Europe again, we see that we are on our back foot because we see that we don't have these industrial capabilities because we didn't need them. We didn't need these capacities. And in fact, the best security you can have is just to be in good relation with your neighbors. That's the best security you can have. If you look at tackling your neighbors all the time, well, you definitely need a strong army. But if you consider that your neighbor is a good guy and you can, if there is a problem, you can find a solution to this problem by just talking to him, then you probably need an army. I mean, I'm certainly one of those people who think that you need an army. I mean, as I said, you always have an army in your country. Either it's yours or it's the army of another one. So you need to have an army, but you may not need to have an oversized army. And we see now that the U.S. is spending so much money for an oversized army and they're not even able to provide weapons both to Israel and Ukraine. And when they provide weapons, they're not even able to provide the latest one, but they have to go into obsolete weapons and all that, and they don't have enough. So, meaning that you have a lot of money which is used for nothing. I mean, you have a lot of cost bound to an oversized army, because when you have an army spread over all the world, but you need to provide food for them. You have a lot of logistics. Most of your money goes into logistics, in fact. So we spend a lot of money for basically no return on investment, no concrete return on investment. It's money spending for nothing, basically. It costs a lot of money for nothing. And you see that the Russians, in reality, are much more efficient. In reality, they have a budget which is a fraction of the U.S. budget, and they have, for that money, they have much more production capabilities and much more tanks, and they have. I don't know if they have more soldiers, probably not, but still they have probably more capabilities than even the West has, you know. So we have developed oversized military systems and extraordinarily complex weapon systems that are defeated by the Houthis, for instance, which is definitely probably not the most technologically developed area, and it's a poor country. I mean, Yemen is a poor country, but nevertheless, with those, with what they have, with their capabilities, with their resources, they are able to counter and to even destroy sophisticated U.S. drones. And again, we are talking where we can take the example of Hezbollah in northern Israel, with Israel being, or is considered as, the best army in the Middle East. But you see that day after day, Hezbollah can destroy their installation, including intelligence or installation along the border with Lebanon, and the Israeli can do nothing. They have absolutely no ability to counter the attacks of Hezbollah, because even the Iron Dome system is targeted by drones that are supposed to be destroyed by the Iron Dome system. So, because you have people who are very smart and can develop technologies that can outsmart the Israelis, you have the same thing in Gaza, by the way. It's exactly the same thing, with very limited resources, but a lot of ingenuity and a lot of courage as well. They manage to counter the strongest army in the Middle East. So, you know, sometimes we tend to overestimate the power of our industrial capabilities, of our we think because we have very expensive systems, they might be better suited for this or that battlefield. In reality, we see it's exactly the opposite. And look at the weapons that the Russians are used. They have basically very old artillery pieces. If you look at the Grad BM-21, this is a system we know since the 60s, and the Russians still use them very effectively. They have improved the rockets and things like that, and they have adjusted the system to the modern command and control systems. But basically, it's the same system as they had 60 years ago, and it still works and it's still effective. While every equipment we have provided to the Ukrainians is totally inadequate. The Russians have developed system. I mean, they have modular approach to their weapon system, meaning that the tanks look very similar, by the way, because they have similar components. But when you have a technological innovation, you just change the few modules, and then you have a modern equipment. So it costs a fraction of what it would cost in Europe, but it's more effective because then with minimal investment you can you can adjust your equipment, adapt your equipment to the environment, and that's why they are very they are more effective than we are in the West. We spend a lot of money for nothing, and the example of Ukraine. I mean, Ukraine is an example of that. How much billions we have invested in Ukraine for nothing, for literally nothing, because everything we have done has failed. So we are, from a cost effectiveness point of view, we're extremely weak, extremely weak. And again, this is not new. The Viet Cong won against the U.S. The Taliban won against the U.S. The Iraqi won against the U.S. The Houthis are threatening the most powerful super aircraft carrier of the U.S. The Eisenhower was apparently threatened by the Houthis. So there is something very strange in that, because if you see, as a taxpayer, if you see the gap between what we pay for this very expensive equipment and the results that this equipment brings, there's a terrible gap. And I'm not even counting the human losses related to these conflicts for nothing, literally nothing. We have played with Ukraine, literally. We have played with Ukraine. I really think that the Ukrainians should take revenge against their Westerners. I really, I mean, if I were Ukrainian, I would be very upset. I would be more upset at the Europeans than at the Russians. With the same principle, I mean, the Russians are doing what they feel okay to do, and Ukrainians do what they feel okay to do. But the Europeans, I mean, this is just cynicism, hypocrisy, and cynicism to use a country against another one, to play a war with the blood of others. This is exactly what the Europeans. It's extremely cynical approach, and despicable. To be honest, it's extremely despicable. Again, I've said many times, probably on this kind of, again, if I were a Ukrainian military, I would certainly fight with my brothers against the Russians. If I were Russian, I would probably fight with my brothers against the Ukrainians, because when you are in those countries, well, for good or bad reasons, you feel that it's your duty to defend your country or to do whatever. So I'm not judging that. I'm not judging. It's normal. The same as soldiers were during World War I, World War II, they felt they were doing the right thing. They were doing that for their government, and they were doing that. I mean, I'm not talking about the war crimes and all that, which is when you go beyond your duty. That's another story. But when you do what you're supposed to do within the rules of the war, and you're doing honestly with courage and all that, well, that's no problem. But the problem is when you are not involved in a conflict, and your only action in the conflict is to push the one or the other of the parties to fight them, and to You just give them weapons, but you don't go yourself because you don't want to be harmed. You know, this is the summit of cowardice, literally. When you do the war with the blood of others, and that's exactly what Europeans have done. I mean, the U.S. as well, the Westerners at large. But again, I'm even more upset at the Europeans than at the U.S. because I said, well, if you have a strategy, you decide you have an enemy, and it's I think for bad reasons. But okay, let's assume you have an enemy. So you define a strategy, and it was the same thing with the. I said the same thing, by the way, in 2003 when the U.S. attacked Iraq. That was totally wrong, and I remember that in November 2022 I wrote a report at my to my minister saying that there were no weapons of mass destruction and all that, and we should trust the team of Mr. Blick, the weapons inspector of the UN and all that. But anyway, and when you had this war starting, I said, well, I was definitely against this war, but I said I can understand the position of the Americans. For some reason, they want to attack Iraq. Okay, so they lie for this. Okay, I mean, it's not okay, but I can understand that. You want to achieve something, so you create the narrative to achieve that something. The problem is for those countries who have absolutely no interest in doing the conflict, like Europeans. They had absolutely no interest. They did. The Americans, for some reason, they felt it was a matter of national security. That was wrong, but that was the way they understood things. But for the Europeans, there was absolutely no interest whatsoever. But they still decided to side with the US. And that's where I don't understand. It's exactly the same thing with Ukraine. For some reason, the US wants to confront China, and for that reason, they decide they need a weakened Russia. They need to have a weakened Russia. Okay, so they do that, and they use Ukraine for that. I think it's a bad strategy, but there is a consistency between their objective and what they want to do. And okay, but for the Europeans, they stand in the middle. They have no interest in harming Russia. On the contrary, by the way, because they have, in terms of energy resources, good relations with Russia, so they have absolutely no interest to confront Russia. They are far away from China. China is a Pacific power, basically, and is considered by the US as challenging the Pacific as a Pacific power. The Americans feel challenged for that. Okay, that's a US-Chinese problem. Why is suddenly Europe threatened by China? As Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO, recently once again said that China is a problem for Europe. I don't see the problem. I mean, you may consider the China as a competitor for EVs or solar panels or microchips and things like this, but we are not in matters of national security. We are just in normal trade competition and probably industrial competition as well, but not as a matter to engage in a war. So why the Europeans suddenly should adopt or be involved in achieving the objectives of the US? That I don't understand. Instead of using this position in the middle as a mediation position, as the ability to address both sides, because they have interest in having relationships with both of the, I mean, all the actors. They stand in the middle. So why should they side with one party? I don't understand that. I'm not saying they should be with Russia, but I don't understand why they are with Ukraine instead of standing in between the two and saying, well, let's talk. And when they were supposed to have this role, and namely France and Germany, as they were the guarantors of the Minsk agreement, they didn't do it. They didn't do it. They didn't do what they were supposed to do. I mean, they were legally supposed to do that and didn't do it. And they choose to side with one party against the other. So this is why I'm a little bit more upset at the Europeans than at the US, even if I don't agree with the foreign policy of the US, in particular towards China, Russia, and probably everything. I mean, the foreign policy of the US is extremely chaotic in my view. But okay, I can understand their logic. I can even, if not agree with their logic, I can understand their logic and say, okay, that it can make sense from their point of view. But from the point of view of Europeans, nothing made sense. In absolutely, however you look at the problem, there's no rational explanation for the Europeans to handle the crisis as they do. Same thing with Palestine. It's exactly the same thing. And you see that in Palestine, it's very similar situation. You have Israel and the US basically, and you have the Palestinians. And we have seen this problem developing since more than 75 years. We know that Israel because Israel is protected by the US, Israel can afford not to abide by international law. That's the problem. And we know that. And everybody knows that. Everybody knows that Israel doesn't want to abide by international law. And we let this situation to rot, to develop up to what happened on the 7th of October. And that will continue probably. And we know that the reason for that is the non-respect of the international law by Israel since 75 years. US may have a reason for helping Israel. I mean, they have reasons. I mean, they have their own reasons. I'm not sure they're the good ones, but they have a rationale. And we can understand that. But today, what do we see? We see that Europe, again, it could stand in the middle and having this position by being the mediation, because we have strong Muslim minorities in Europe, and that gives us the right of being involved in some kind of negotiation or dialogue with Israel regarding the Palestinians. But we don't take this position. We don't take advantage of that position. On the contrary, we side with the US. And now we see that it's a contradiction with what the population feels. Because our populations, they see what we see on the social networks and all that. And the population, not just the Muslim population, but also the general European population, sees that the problem cannot be solved that way. And we are totally on the wrong approach. But no leader is now in a position to talk to anyone because they have lost total credibility. They have no credibility. Even the Americans, by the way, have no credibility anymore. So by taking sides and not taking advantage of being not involved in a conflict in order to help to promote the dialogue, we just create a situation in which we get involved and we just worsen the situation. And this is not the question of, because what we have seen exactly the same thing, by the way, in Palestine as in Russia. So in Russia, we decided that Putin is a dictator, and there's also this indictment of the International Criminal Court against Putin. And we did the same with the Hamas. And suddenly we decided it's a terrorist organization, because for some countries, they didn't decide whether it's a terrorist organization or not, which is, by the way, it's something totally stupid, because when you decide or you define an organization as terrorist, basically you're not changing the situation. The only thing you are doing is that you are closing a door, because then you cannot talk to a terrorist. Therefore, you just close the door for negotiation. So that's the only purpose of designing an organization as terrorist, because otherwise it means absolutely nothing. There is no international definition of terrorism. So, and by the way, when we design, we say the Hamas is terrorist, only Western countries decide this is a terrorist organization. But for the majority of the world, the Hamas is not a terrorist organization. So when people say, well, that happened in France because some said, tried to not to promote the Hamas, but to promote dialogue with the Hamas. But they were accused of apologizing terrorism. This is absurd. But you apologize terrorists because you'd say Hamas is terrorist. But this is just valid in France. For 80% of the population in the world, Hamas is not terrorist. So when you promote dialogue with the Hamas, for 80% of the world population, it's normal. It's just that 20% of the Western part of the world that decide that it's not normal to open dialogue. Basically, it comes to that. So this is where we see the contradiction of trying to close door or to negotiation or to dialogue just by defining one as bad or so. When we had, we had such situation like this in history. We had to negotiate whether there was good or bad people. We finally signed the armistice or ceasefire or peace agreement with the Japan Empire, with Nazi Germany. We signed treaty with them. Because Putin is we don't talk and we cannot negotiate. But we negotiated with the Nazis. You understand where is the logic? Precisely because you don't have the same view as the other party that you need to negotiate. But what's the point saying, no, we cannot negotiate with Putin? Absolutely no sense. It's absolutely no sense. So that applies exactly the same with the Hamas. And that was a discussion with Parliament, by the way, to design. I don't know exactly what the situation is right now, but there was a discussion to have Hamas designated as a terrorist organization. So what's the point? Hamas is not active in Switzerland. We have there is no specific reason. If it were a threat for Switzerland, then you can probably designate as terrorist so that you can take adequate measures to counter this threat. But if it's a situation in Palestine, the best or the worst you can do is to mediate or to help dialogue. So when you designate this organization as terrorist, regardless of how you feel about it, but when you start saying it's terrorist, that means you stop any capability for negotiation or dialogue. So it's absurd. And that's exactly the way we approach things. We have an emotional approach to conflict and to crisis. We don't have a rational, factual, and I would say when it's the same as rational, but
Logical.
Logical, exactly, logical approach to conflict, and that amazes me, because not just because we have not learned of previous conflict, but it shows that we are, and that's also what was demonstrated. We are back to the elections and the European elections that we had at the beginning of the month, but or last month. We see that we have a leadership that is totally disconnected from any reality, and we see the West affected by that, and that, in my view, explains why the West is so in decline. We don't have people with rational approach to the problems. Recently, I just saw a conference or an address given by a politician from Mali, and he explained why they expelled the French and all that. When you hear this guy, I don't remember his name and I don't remember the occasion, by the way, but I've seen that. It's very interesting, by the way, address he made it in French. But when you see these guys, you see that in Africa, they have elites that have a capacity and a capability to assess problems, to discuss problems with distance, with the ability to look at the problem from a strategic point of view, not just from an emotional point of view, but based on facts, based on realities. And you can see they have a much better quality of leadership than we have in Europe. Although when you talk about leadership in Africa and Europe, we tend to consider that these guys are backwards, they don't know, it's a kind of tribal things and all that. It's totally wrong. They have excellent diplomats. They have excellent thinkers. And I have been. I spent 6 years in Africa, and I've been in the field of security and research, and both research and operations aspects of security. And I've been in touch with a lot of people, not just thinkers, but also military and all. I mean, these guys have enormous capabilities in assessing their environment, and they know it much better than we do. By the way, we think we know everything. It's totally wrong. They have, and when I saw this address a couple of days ago, I thought there's a huge discrepancy. The quality of the speaker, I mean, was much better than any politician I have heard in the recent time in Europe. And we see our politicians, they just see problems from an emotional point of view. Putin is a dictator. Hamas is a terrorist organization. So the Palestinians deserve to die because Hamas is a terrorist organization. It's totally stupid. It's totally stupid. Even if all the Palestinians were Hamas, when the children don't deserve to die that way. But even a French journalist a journalist just said, well, it's not the same value because Hamas attacked Israel, so the Israeli children, this is sad where they are killed, but the Palestinians, since they attacked, it's too bad for the children, but that's normal. So killing Palestinian children, this is fine because basically they resist. So It's just amazing to have this kind. But this is a totally emotional approach based on prejudice, based on the relationship we may have with one or the other party, and that's all. But it's not based on a factual analysis of what happened on the ground. Even if we have all these discussions today and more in the Western media that what happened on the 7th of October needs to be revisited because obviously there was some exaggeration and lies made by Israel in order to justify their brutal intervention and bombing of the population in Gaza. We know that today. I mean, even Israelis themselves have acknowledged that there was a total exaggeration in defining what Hamas has done. But if you come in France, you will see that this narrative has not changed. Even if the Times of London has made a huge article debunking the whole issue of the mass rape on the 7th of October, this was reflected by almost no media in the French press. None. So we continue with the narrative that, well, the Palestinians deserve that because they raped so many women. But where is the evidence? None. And only journalists in the US and in UK and in other parts of the world have, and in Israel, by the way, have understood that probably this is not true. There might have been some war crimes during that day made by the Palestinians, but certainly not in the size and the scope that has been portrayed in our media. Certainly not. And but in order to justify and excuse what Israel has done, we come back to these accusations and lies and exaggeration and all that. And this is not the way we should lead countries. Again, we had this period in the French history and the French culture, by the way, of the so-called the Enlightenment. This is this period in the 17th century, end of the 17th century, beginning of the 18th century, where you had these philosophers who they were strongly against the rule in France, because in France the king received his legitimacy and his authority from God, basically, in essence. And this philosophical idea of the Enlightenment of these philosophers was that no, the authority cannot come from God. It has to be based on the interest of the people. It has to be based. Basically, they were outlining what we have in our modern democracies, having kind of a rationale for making decisions, and not just decide because God has told me that I can decide, so I decide. No, this must be based on facts, on statistics, on the things that are measurable, and you can maybe profit. You can go up to that, but I mean that must be rational, and that's how modern democracies were built. That this idea of a rationality of decision making. Therefore, this organization of the rule of law, having an executive branch, a legislative branch, and a judicial branch to address problem and to address, to control themselves also, and to have a rational approach to decision making. And what we are witnessing since a couple of years in Europe, I would say since about 20 years, when if I take into account the global war on terror, what we are witnessing is exactly, we come back to the situation of the pre-Enlightenment period. where in fact we decide because we are God. And when I say that, it's not even it's not something that I invent myself. You may have seen these pictures. That was in 2003, 2004, as the U.S. Special Forces were recruiting in the U.S. You had those big posters. If it would be too long to look for them in my files, but I could show that in the next program if you want. But there was those posters where the recruitment posters, and it was recruitment for God and the country. You know, for God and the country. And you had also this. I mentioned that in one of my books, which is quite strange, by the way. That's on the you have on the U.S. M16 rifle. You have a system to. Oh no, I'm missing the word. To aim, an aiming device, and these aiming devices were made by a company named Frigicon or something like that. And the director of that company is very much Christian. So when he received an order for providing those aiming devices for the M16 to Middle East and Afghanistan, he engraved on each of these aiming devices that were then fixed on the M16. On each of them was the reference of a gospel of the Bible. You know? Meaning that giving kind of religious dimension or to this. So we are back to a mission given by God. It's no longer something rational. By the way, nobody has rationally explained why we were in Afghanistan, why we were in Iraq, and all that. Everything is explained by something non-rational, by something else. And of course, we say that the others were fighting for God and fighting for Allah and all that. The reality is that the West fought in the Middle East for God, literally, and that's very interesting. There you can find if you are curious, you can look those references, because a lot of articles have been published about those engravements on the aiming device, on this aiming scope for the Frigicon system, and even you had the U.S. military in Iraq received some Bible kits, literally. So we are beyond rationale. We are back to this period where we're empowered by God, and I fully respect, and I think it's even a good thing to have a faith and to believe in God. The name can be Yahweh, can be Allah, can be God, can be. I mean, you can take them, but it's a good thing to have a moral reference and faith reference. I think it's totally legitimate, and I think it's a good thing. But it is not the kind of thing that should dictate our decision making. We should keep, and we have for that, we have a legal system, we have a legal apparatus that could help us to make decisions from a rational point of view, and not because of God. It's not, we don't, God never told us to make war against. We were never told by God that we can bomb children. That's nowhere, absolutely nowhere. So, but for us, it's a good. We can accept that. For the others, it's bad. For the others, it's bad. So we should go back. I mean, I'm pledging going back to this idea of enlightenment, where we make decisions by yes, enlighten the or decision making. By the way, if you look for instance in German, when you talk about reconnaissance, or even to some extent in when you say intelligence, in German the word is Aufklärung. Aufklärung means enlightenment. It's the idea because when you in fact, you should bring some light to your decision. That's the idea. That's the idea. We should go back to that. Intelligence, by the way, intelligence in English comes from the Latin intellegere. That means to understand. It's not to spy, to kill, to assassinate. Intelligence means to understand. And intelligence as base for decision making supposes that you understand before you make a decision. That's the real purpose of intelligence, to understand and nothing else. And but the thing is that we wage wars, we push other nations into war without understanding what's going on, just because we feel that yeah, it's good, it's in line with my prejudice, so it's okay. But it's not how it should be. We should and I noticed that in most cases, I mean, I've been involved in lots of different conflicts and crises, especially in Africa, where I had to mediate or help contribute to mediating, and sometimes I had to mediate between tribes or parties or armed groups and all that in the Sahel region and in Congo, South Sudan, and all that. And I noticed that the most difficult part of that is not the mediation for itself, is to understand the two parties, to understand how the first party understands the conflict, and to understand how the other party understands the conflict. That's the most difficult part. But that's absolutely unavoidable. If you want to mediate, you have to understand what they want. You have to understand how they think. You have to understand how they are. You have to understand where they come from, and you have to understand what they want to achieve and where they want to go. And then you can start to have a mediation. Not just for the sake of having peace, it's for the sake of solving a problem. And that is very difficult. And I noticed how often you had people who had been living in a region for decades have never really been interested about the population. They don't understand what people think. They don't understand how people live. They don't understand how these people just understand life, understand the world, understand the relationship to the next tribe and all that. Because when we go as Westerners in those countries, we usually we live as a privileged people because we have more money and we have better housing and we have bigger cars and so we ignore the population with which we live. And when it comes to negotiation, then of course we see those individuals confronting each other. And then we have to understand that. And that's in every crisis situation I've seen in Africa, but also in other parts of the world where I've been. I saw the inability of or the leadership in general to understand what was going on. That's exactly the problem with Ukraine. We're back to what we said before. I mean, when we talk about the conflict in Ukraine, a lot of people will, I mean, those who think that Russia is right, they will say, well, that's because NATO. No, it's not really because of NATO. The problem of NATO is something that exists, but it's not for that reason that Russia intervened on the 24th of February, 2022. If you're a Ukrainian, then if you're on the Ukrainian side, then you say that, well, because Russia has attacked because Putin is a dictator and he wants to attack the whole of Europe. So, but at the same time, you see that they are in difficulty on the battlefield in Avdiivka or in Bakhmut or wherever, and you expect to have a big offensive against the whole of Europe within months. So it doesn't make any sense because again, we are not basing our understanding of the event on the fact, but we are basing this understanding on our prejudice. We don't like the Russians as we don't like the Arabs, and therefore we suppose that they behave because of this or that and that, and that's all. And that's our belief that in fact these are decision making. So there's absolutely no reason and no possibility that we can win in such a situation. If you understand your enemy, there's absolutely no chance to achieve victory. And we have seen that, we are witnessing that in Palestine. The Hamas knows the Israeli much better than the Israelis know the Hamas. The Hamas knows us much better than we know the Hamas. Same applies to Hezbollah, and same applies to the Russians. They know us much better than we know them. And that was the same thing with the Ukrainians versus the Russians. The Ukrainians assumed or took over the narrative, the Western narrative, to understand the Russians. And suddenly they found that there was a discrepancy between what they thought their enemy was and what the enemy was in effect. So there is absolutely no chance of victory. And that was, by the way, this is something that has been described by Sun Tzu 1,500 years ago, 2,500 years ago. It describes exactly that. If you know your rationale, and if you don't know your rationale and you know the rationale of the enemy will win in any situation. If you know your rationale and the rationale of the enemy, you have 50 chance to win. If you don't know your rationale and you don't know the rationale of the enemy, you have no chance to win. But that's exactly where we are. We don't know our rationale. We don't know the rationale of the others, and that's why we fail. And that cannot be. It cannot be otherwise. It cannot be otherwise. NATO. I mean, not NATO, because NATO is not involved in as an organization, the NATO countries. But let's say the West is engaged in a conflict that it will not win because it doesn't know the whereabouts of this conflict. It doesn't understand the conflict it's fighting. So there's absolutely no chance for the West to win. And unfortunately, the price of this ignorance is paid by the Ukrainians.